The following Connecticut Experience presentation is part of the ongoing partnership between the Connecticut Humanities Council and Connecticut Public Television. Together, we're exploring Connecticut's rich history and culture.
Connecticut and its cities. 3 centuries of change is made possible by the Hartford Foundation for Public Giving, with additional support provided by Webster Bank.
People in Connecticut, like Americans in general, are often ambivalent about their cities. We see them as centers of civilization, culture, and vitality, yet also as places of danger and degradation. We see our cities as reflecting much of what is best and what is worst in ourselves as a people. This ambivalence is nothing new. From colonial times, Connecticut people have both valued cities as centers of commerce and learning and feared them as unruly concentrations of poverty and disorder. Our cities themselves have changed enormously. The small commercial cities that dotted Connecticut waterways in colonial times were superseded by much larger industrial cities dispersed throughout the entire state. These cities remain today, but the industries that made them centers of wealth creation and economic advancement have shrunk or even vanished. Today, Connecticut has 21 chartered cities and several other uncharted urban centers. They vary in size and political structure, but all are complex concentrations of institutions, activities, and people. How did our cities become what they are today? What are they becoming now? What should they become? The answers to these questions affect not only city dwellers, but those who live in Connecticut's suburban and rural areas as well. For its first century, Connecticut was a rural agricultural society whose largest towns were little more than villages.
The ideal of those early settlements was that you would have a community in which all of the civil citizens were also members of the church, so that you had a godly city, a city upon the hill, and the idea was these were going to be God's little villages, and all the world was supposed to look and emulate.
They were Puritans from Boston who arrived in 1632, 1633, and found Boston and the area overcrowded. And they came here really as part of Massachusetts to get the beautiful land of the Connecticut River Valley.
The Connecticut River was one of the most prominent sites for settlements because it provided inland routes to the farming communities, yet it also provided access to the oceans and Long Island Sound and coastal trading.
The settlers displaced the Indian inhabitants of Connecticut and established a colonial government, which in turn established the towns.
Towns, of course, were created by the colony government. There's a great sense in New England that towns have a certain autonomy, but they don't at all. That's a myth. Towns were created by the colony for the administrative convenience of the colony, really. The towns can't originate any powers or any authority. The towns can only do what the colony tells them they can do. Ultimately, in Connecticut, all of the territory was carved up into towns. There was no inch of Connecticut that wasn't part of a town.
Gradually, a few of these little settlements began to grow and to develop a new role.
It was, of course, out of these villages that ultimately larger cities grew. And the ones that prospered most were the ones that were on good seaports, or at least water ports. Hartford and Middletown, up the Connecticut River, and then, of course, New London, New Haven, Norwich. These were the principal villages that developed into cities.
These emerging cities traded Connecticut's crops and livestock for manufactured goods and sugar imported primarily from England and the West Indies. By 1754, an English official traveling through Connecticut described New Haven.
A town of trading, the harbor full of vessels.
If you came into the harbor in New Haven, you'd look out and you'd just see all these ship masts there. So you might see at any given time 60 or 70, and it would be a beehive of activity. People would be coming and going, and there'd be rickety wharfs, and people would be unloading things. You would have a sense of real activity.
From the earliest days, cities were centers of cultural vitality. A European visitor to New Haven was amazed at the balls where the invitees danced minuets and country dances until 1 o'clock in the morning.
100 charming girls, dressed with elegant simplicity.
English visitors were always impressed with them. They always came expecting to see people dancing around tree stumps and wearing strange buckskin clothes. They were always amazed at the degree of urbanity. By the 1750s and 1760s, you saw wine merchants, you saw milliners, you saw dancing schools, you saw steeples, you saw activity, you saw very sophisticated businesses.
At a wedding in Norwich, 90 guests danced 92 jigs, 52 contra dances, 45 minuets, and 17 hornpipes.
And the people living in the centers of those communities began to think of themselves as being different from the rest of Connecticut. They were more sophisticated, they developed these worldly tastes, they certainly were much less puritanical than their grandparents had been.
The late 18th century villages that became cities were typified by what we call a walking city. Typically, a bootmaker would live upstairs and have a shop downstairs. Lawyers would live upstairs and have their office downstairs. And these people were in face-to-face contact all the time. It was a wonderful way to build a community.
Connecticut cities became centers of poverty as well as wealth. Landless laborers concentrated in the cities. Care of the poor became a subject of public debate, and almshouses came into being.
We have, for the first time in the mid to late 18th century, people who are unable to make their way in the world living in cities, partly because as the community became larger, it became less concerned with being their brother's keeper. And there's less of a spirit of community and of parish and of church to care for people, and more of an institutionalization.
African Americans had lived in Connecticut from the beginning of the colony.
When people think about the black community, they almost forget that there were black Yankees who had been here for 300-400 years, and that they had built institutions as well.
So there was a tendency in the late 18th century for African Americans to move into the cities, and by the 1790s this was a very visible movement. And you have in New Haven and Hartford and Norwich and New London and a few other places little tiny black communities.
Urbanization brought conflict between city dwellers and the rural people on the outskirts of town.
As these Connecticut maritime villages became more compact in their populations and more complex in the kinds of services that were necessary, they began to try to get the town meetings to enlarge the wharf or to put lighting along the wharf or to establish a fire department. And farmers would come in from the outlying areas to these town meetings and vote these things down. They weren't going to get any advantage from them, and why should they pay their taxes for these frills?
Rural areas often split off from the emerging cities. Farmers in the rural Hamden section of New Haven petitioned the state government to separate them from the city.
Merchants, professional men, have notions and modes of conducting business very different from your petitioners. We're all farmers.
If you look in the 18th century, you'll probably find 200 petitions to the colony and state government from various parts of towns wishing to separate from other parts of towns. And during the Revolution, they took on a curious urgency. They often mimicked the rhetoric of the revolutionaries. No taxation without representation. We have no common interest with these people. There were little revolutions against the big cities by all the outlying small towns. And the farmers tended to dominate town government. They did not want to pass tax rates. And merchants increasingly felt that they needed some control over the compact part of town if their town was going to be able to grow into a city and compete. And what eventually happens in the 1780s is Connecticut creates the first cities in New England.
In 1784, just after the American Revolution, Connecticut's 5 leading towns were incorporated as cities, adding a new layer of government to the urbanized areas of each town.
The city of Hartford, at first, is also still part of the town of Hartford. And what happens is there are two governments there. There's a city government of Hartford, and it deals with local issues for the merchants and the urban people. But then when the town meets, they also deal with the issues for the whole town. But they're able to pass separate rates and do development for the compact area without having to tax the farmers. So both farmers and urban dwellers liked it.
In the 19th century, Connecticut cities developed a new role as centers of industry.
Well, manufacturing began to take over about the 1830s when steam power entered the picture. Before then, of course, most of the industry in Connecticut was run by water power. At one time, Connecticut had over 200 manufacturing villages spread around the state, and all of them depended upon water power to run their machines. But when steam power came along, it meant that the factories could be centralized in the urban areas.
In Danbury, there were no waterfalls, there were no real river that could be dammed for a mill run, so water power made it impossible for Danbury to have very big factories. But when the railroad came to Danbury, what it meant was coal could be brought in large quantities that could fuel big factories. So what you get here, because of the railroad, I think, is an increase in scale. Larger machines, more power, because of the coal, and Danbury's industry really accelerates because of that.
Initially, the movers and shakers of the Middletown community had proposed a railroad in the 1830s, but it was held up in the legislature by steamboat owners who were afraid of losing revenue on the steamships that were plying the Connecticut River. Because Middletown was delayed in getting the railroad by about 20 years, it required Middletown to be more enterprising in how they were going to build their economy without direct links to Hartford and Boston. It slowed them down, and it did not become a city comparable to New Haven or Hartford.
Commercial cities and former mill villages across the state rapidly developed into industrial cities for a number of reasons.
Take New Haven. Chauncey Jerome moves his clock factory here just before the Civil War, and gets really good at the mass production of brass gears. In fact, world dominant. New Haven becomes Timex to the world at that time. And that shapes the machine tool industry here. Once you get a start in an industry or cluster of industries, what the economists call the external economies, the advantages that each firm throws off to other firms in generating knowledge, in sustaining a workforce, in sustaining small suppliers and service organizations which make things work, there gets to be a kind of virtuous spiral, a spiral upward.
So certainly a big part of the story of the development of Connecticut cities as industrial places is the specialization that occurred. It's really pretty amazing when you consider how much of the nation's brass goods were produced in Waterbury, or how a very significant portion of the firearms were produced in Hartford and New Haven. Typewriters, Bridgeport and Hartford were probably responsible for a pretty significant part of the nation's output. It's said in building hardware that New Britain produced nearly half the building hardware that was produced in the United States at the end of the 19th century.
Of course, a very interesting question, perhaps a central question when you're looking at the matter of cities in Connecticut, is how come Connecticut never did have one big city, and why are we just between New York and Boston?
Many of the early promoters of Connecticut seaports had grandiose dreams, thought that they could rival in Connecticut, Boston, or New York. But they faced insuperable geographical obstacles. The absence of naturally deep ports was serious, but perhaps even more serious was the lack of a good set of waterways connecting the interior. And here you couldn't compete with New York, because New York had the Hudson River, and then, of course, in the 1820s, the Erie Canal was built, which connected to the whole central part of the United States. And Connecticut couldn't do that. Now, there was a dream. There was the Farmington Canal, but it was too small and it was too late. New York, meanwhile, and Boston that had developed the whole infrastructure of major world shipping and had great harbors. And no port in Connecticut could ever compete with that, and they can't compete to this day.
In the commercial era, they didn't develop. You say, well, okay, what about the industrial era? Why wouldn't they develop there? And of course, they did develop very, very rapidly. We have probably the premier 19th century city is Bridgeport for the nation. When you look at the history of that city and its incredible, phenomenal growth in the 19th century. Why didn't it develop also? Well, by this time, the financial and other interests that became focused in New York and in Boston were so dominating that Connecticut could never catch up.
For 200 years, most of Connecticut's people were descendants of the early Puritan settlers. But in the early 19th century, immigrants began pouring into the state's cities, starting with the Irish.
In Connecticut, the first groups of Irish people were workers that came to build the canals in the 1820s. Several hundred in the case of the Windsor Locks Canal and the Farmington Canal. I think that Hartford and so much of urban America was experiencing this tremendous growth primarily because of industrialization. That growth created a demand for unskilled labor. Somebody had to pave those streets. Someone had to build those houses. Somebody had to chop the wood or haul the coal for those factories. So there was a great need for unskilled labor, and for the most part, that's what Irish men did.
The Yankees had very mixed feelings about these new immigrants. The industrialists wanted them. They were a cheap labor force. And the industrialists ran Connecticut pretty much through most of the 20th century. The power structure welcomed these immigrants. Of course, the people with whom they were competing for industrial jobs were not happy, and there was always a great deal of prejudice against them.
Small-town Connecticut often regarded immigrant urban Connecticut as a threat. When urban legislators proposed to remove a law prohibiting professional athletic contests on Sundays, a Salisbury legislator asked,
"Are we ready for commercialism because of the pressure brought to bear by the alien population of the great cities?"
Irish immigrants also disturbed old Connecticut with their successful entry into city politics.
They become the stalwart supporters of the Democratic Party, but they ask things of the Democratic Party. What they ask for are city jobs, city contracts, places on the police force, money for things in the Irish neighborhood. They're not pawns of the Democrats, but they're exacting a price for their participation. And this is the way a group makes it in American politics.
But the political power of the city's new immigrants was limited by the state constitution. It gave large and small towns nearly equal representation in the legislature.
You had towns as small as Union with a couple hundred people with 2 representatives to the lower house of the General Assembly, and you had these burgeoning cities also with 2 representatives. So over a period of time, what happened was that the rural villages came to dominate politics in Connecticut, at least in the General Assembly. By 1950, 11% of the voters could elect a majority of the lower house.
Connecticut's cities continued to become more densely populated and were widely and often accurately seen as centers of poverty and disease.
Well, cities have always been places of disease simply because people live more closely together and diseases are more readily transmitted. So in the 19th century, you had cholera, yellow fever. People would bring malaria back from the tropics. The sanitation in most cities took a really long time to catch up with the density of living.
Crime increasingly became a fact of urban living. In the mid-19th century, New Haven moved from a voluntary watch system to a professional police force, and by 1871, it had a force of 50 police officers.
Cities, of course, have always had their desperate neighborhoods. They were inhabited by the poor, the scraggly. They were usually down by the wharfs. Seafaring people, dives, houses of prostitution, and unfortunately these areas were the low-rent areas as well, and so that poor people would have to congregate there whether they wanted to or not.
City leaders tried to redesign their cities to eliminate undesirable neighborhoods.
The first redevelopment in Hartford was actually the creation of Bushnell Park. The Reverend Horace Bushnell deplored the fact that there were slums along what we used to call the Little River that wound downtown all the way out to the Connecticut. So we said, let's get rid of these terrible things and create a municipal park in Hartford.
The area that was Bushnell Park was very unattractive. There were all the tanneries along the Mill River, also known as the Hog River. And because it was run down, it was one of the few places in Hartford where Irish people could put their shanties, where African American people could afford to buy property. Bushnell had the idea, which is a very progressive idea for the time, that if you could create an oasis in the middle of the city, it would provide a calming influence on what even then were perceived as a faster pace to urban life. And unfortunately, this 200 some odd people were in the way of that. They were compensated for their property that was taken for the park, and yet this mixed community of Irish and African Americans never really coalesced anywhere else. So it was broken up. It was the first instance of a community being broken up for urban renewal that I know of in Connecticut, though not the last.
Despite their problems, for more than a century, Connecticut's industrial cities were engines of wealth and productivity, centers of culture and civilization, and vehicles for economic enfranchisement.
By 1865, Hartford was considered the wealthiest city in the United States per capita. It was at the time when manufacturing became the dominant economy. It employed more people than there were in farming and insurance. But manufacturing was king. And it remained the dominant factor in Connecticut's economy for 100 years.
While the industry provided jobs and wealth, Connecticut cities continued to be thriving centers of culture.
Hartford has always been a center of culture. In the 18th century, we had the Hartford Wits, which was the first literary group in the nation. Then in the early 19th century, Hartford became a publishing center. I think there were over 21 publishers. That's what drew Mark Twain to Hartford. Then, of course, you had Nook Farm, where Mark Twain settled, Harriet Beecher Stowe. In 1842, Daniel Wadsworth built the Wadsworth Athenaeum, the first public art museum in the country.
The cities are really the centers of the achievement of the industrial age. Connecticut was the Silicon Valley of the 19th century. It was the place which experienced the highest levels of achievement in the great industrial revolution of the 19th century, which transformed the world as surely as the information age is transforming our world today. Huge fortunes were made, and these cities in many ways are a legacy of the industrial age. The modern city as we know it was really a creation of the industrial age, with its infrastructure of social service agencies and cultural institutions and educational institutions and great neighborhoods. And it's only the cities that have that complexity to them and that diversity of richness to them.
During the golden years of the industrial age, downtown Hartford was also a nationally known retail center.
G. Fox & Company was the oldest department store in Hartford. It was founded in 1847 by Gershon Fox, and it became really the retail center of downtown Hartford. Eventually, there were several other department stores that were founded, like Sage Allen, Brown Thompson, Steigers, but G. Fox & Company was the queen of them all.
Many Connecticut residents cherish memories of its cities as vibrant and exciting places to live and work.
I started in G. Fox in 1939. Well, a lot of people
yes.
would say to you, oh, you work in Foxes. That emphasize Foxes, you know.
I don't think there was anyone that ever moved into the state that didn't immediately know it was a wonderful department store. They were busy all the time. Oh, it was always mobbed, and she had a wonderful restaurant on the second floor, and they sometimes had fashion shows there. She'd have people walk around, and the food was always good there. And customers dressed in those days. They came down and they spent the day downtown.
Yeah.
They had lunch. It was an outing.
It was a delightful place to work. I enjoyed every 34 years of it. It's hard to believe, I think, these days that there was such a place.
New Haven was another vibrant city in Connecticut during the economic boom years of World War II.
The period of World War II, New Haven and Connecticut in general is basically a war manufacturing area. And it was then there was a big influx of people coming into work. So what happened, the influx came in, and the vitality, of course, then, everybody was making money. And, of course, you didn't care where anybody was from. There were weekend dance sessions where they block off a whole street. Duke came through, Count Basie came through. All of them, they used to make the circuit. Practically every big player got booked here. Billie Holiday, it came through. In fact, I played behind Billie Holiday at Lillian's Paradise. And they'd come through, and they'd be here for Saturday night. And the whole street would be blocked off, and everybody could come. I mean, not only the black community, everybody came and listened to the band. We didn't think of how great they were at the time. We were out there dancing, having a great time.
Even as the industrial city reached its zenith, the forces that would ultimately undermine it were already gathering. Just as the railroad in the 19th century had centralized industry and its workers in Connecticut cities, so the automobile in the 20th century made it possible for people to move out of the cities to the surrounding suburbs and rural areas.
The car can't be left out of this story. By 1923, you look in the newspaper want ads in a city like New Haven, and you can buy an almost new Model T for less than $100. So people are buying these things in huge numbers. The immediate effect was to give the central cities a heart attack, a clot of traffic which formed around the central business district. And in New Haven, that was an acute enough problem to be the mayor's #1 issue by 1923, and it continued to be the #1 problem for downtown retailing all the way into the urban renewal era at the end of the 1950s. And they solved it then with a neutron bomb, right? By destroying the traditional central city retailing and installing great arteries to drain away the traffic toward suburban malls.
Further changes came after World War II, as the state began a shift away from a manufacturing economy.
The federal government also created through taxes and through the FHA incentives for new construction in greenfield sites, which made it economically sensible to build suburban housing in great quantities and to induce white flight, often not flight from blacks, but flight from a city which had 100 years of accumulated problems.
The move from cities to suburbs was helped by federal and state policies that range from transportation and taxation to education and housing.
In Connecticut, much like in other states in the Union, the federal government essentially subsidizes the growth of suburbs during the mid-50s through the late 70s. The Federal Housing Authority subsidized suburban home ownership. And what's striking is that it explicitly did not subsidize urban home ownership.
The state of Connecticut provided the growing suburban towns with educational subsidies to build new schools, and the 1956 Federal Interstate Highway Act paid 90% of the cost of major highways. The new highways open large non-urban areas to industry and commuting. That affected city people and suburban people in very different ways.
Poor folks in Hartford don't have access to suburban jobs as equally as suburbanites have access to Hartford jobs. I mean that suburbanites who have cars can get into Hartford. But the Hartford public transportation system, even going to suburban malls, is concertedly inadequate. In part because they wanted to control the urban youth coming out to the malls, but it also undermined the ability of workers to work in stores, to get to suburban small factories or whatever. So you get the case in Hartford, for instance, of people who really may want to work, but who are really caught geographically in the city.
The problems of Connecticut cities were aggravated by the state's centuries-old rotten borough system of political representation, which allowed small rural towns to dominate the legislature.
This, of course, was a great scandal. It wasn't unique to Connecticut. It was happening in a number of other places, and there were a number of Supreme Court decisions that ultimately said this violated the 14th Amendment Equal Protections Clause. And Connecticut had to face that, and the U.S. Supreme Court issued decisions that ultimately compelled Connecticut to rewrite its constitution and to do away with the rotten borough system and to have a system in which people were represented properly. Unfortunately, another movement, a demographic movement, had overtaken events, and one would think, okay, now the cities are going to get their fair share of representatives. But by the time that this was put into place in 1966, the suburban movement had overtaken, and as a matter of fact, the cities never did get their fair share of representatives.
Starting in the 1950s, Connecticut cities, particularly New Haven, became pioneers of a massive national effort to address urban problems that came to be known as urban renewal. These programs provided large federal subsidies to clear away what were called blighted urban areas and replace them with new construction and highways. Urban renewal remains controversial to this day.
Urban renewal doesn't happen by accident in New Haven, and it isn't an invention of a local mayor. It isn't Dick Lee's idea uniquely. It's a national policy. It grows out of the Housing Act of 1949. And it responds to the declining economic vitality of a whole class of American cities.
There were so many problems in this city. It was almost as though no one has been paying attention, and it really was true. They were not paying attention. Nobody was worrying about the city.
The big picture is Americans forgetting what a city was all about. And in their enthusiasm for the automobile, they destroyed cities everywhere throughout the United States to ensure the free passage of the automobile right through urban areas. And what they decided they'd do is kill two birds with one stone from their point of view and get rid of what they call slums. And they really burst through New Haven in the middle 60s, so they brought this right through the Oak Street area.
The plan was to replace the Oak Street neighborhood with the Oak Street Connector, linking downtown with major highways.
Well, the basic overall goal was to rebuild the city and to give a helping hand for the hundreds, if not the thousands of people who were bereft of a decent standard of living. And when we got the money to do development, we approached the Oak Street neighborhood. It was the most blighted section of New Haven.
I was born and raised in New Haven, in the Oak Street area. While the buildings weren't the best and people called it the slum, the attitude of the people, it was a true community. We still consider people who lived on Spruce Street, even though they weren't blood relatives, as relatives.
Well, this picture was taken on Oak Street. And there was a candy store here my dad had, number 124 Oak Street. And this was London's Bakery, 126 Oak Street.
Everyone would shop every day. Every butcher, a baker, a shoemaker, a Chinese hand laundry.
They were the poorest kinds of homes in New Haven.
There were structures 3 or 4 stories or 6 stories, and they were without gas or without electricity, some of them even without running water. And roaches and cockroaches and rats, the kind of vermin that you associate with the most degrading quality of life that you can think of. I think there are 886 families down there. We had to move them. And we did move most of them. Some moved out themselves. We had 10,000 rats down there. They were big. They were almost like dogs.
Well, Dick was right that they were rats there. They didn't get rid of the rats. They got rid of the people in the buildings. They didn't get rats.
Nearly 4 decades later, residents displaced from the Oak Street neighborhood still gather for an annual reunion.
Ladies and gentlemen, I want to welcome you to the 38th Oak Street Reunion Dinner. I was very fortunate to have lived on Oak Street, for it gave me an opportunity to meet so many, many great people. And that's what makes this reunion so special.
I had a piece of property where we had our printing business. Ended up moving to West Haven only because a redevelopment made promises that we would be relocated within the city. The appraiser came in from the city and he said, "Don't worry, you'll come out fine out of this thing. We've got people out for relocation." Where did they take me? Out to all the suburbs. Nowhere within the city was I offered a piece of land for redevelopment, not one piece.
The Oak Street Connector replaced approximately 400 businesses. When the businesses left, the people who owned them left too. Redevelopment in New Haven has been described as a failure, and it did eliminate the slums of Oak Street. And my opinion, after all the research, is that it indeed had to go.
We did the very best we could. The Oak Street area, when we cleared it, made possible a location for a new telephone company building, and it employed 2,500 people, and it was on the tax list for $25 million. Well, that's a pretty damn good development, I'd say.
Urban renewal in New Haven is basically one of America's tragedies. The city received more tax dollars for urban renewal per person than any other city in America, and basically used those tax dollars to destroy low-income housing without replacing it.
The passions raised by urban renewal still shape our debate over how best to revitalize our cities. Does the answer lie in large-scale redevelopment projects or in smaller-scale, more neighborhood-based forms of regeneration?
Nobody knows the trouble I've seen.
While suburbanization was eliminating inner-city jobs and urban renewal was eliminating inner-city housing, African Americans from the South were migrating to Connecticut. Increasingly, the story of Connecticut cities became intertwined with the story of African Americans.
Many of the job opportunities for African Americans in the South had been jobs sharecropping, farming, agricultural jobs for the most part. And new technologies, mechanization coming along, displaces those people. They no longer have that kind of work available to them. Not all of them, but a great many of those workers then migrate to the north in search of jobs.
The irony of manufacturing as a magnet. People arrive just at the crest of the wave in the 40s and 50s with African Americans coming in from the South, and the period leading up to the civil rights era in the 60s. The job base is just draining away, draining away, draining away. So it's the worst of all timing. And the African Americans were stuck partly by prejudice as it showed up in real estate markets, and partly by social services, which were linked to central city neighborhoods, and public housing, which was concentrated in very considerable quantities near these plants. All those forces kept people in place as the jobs went away.
I don't think that the conditions in Connecticut or in any northern city could possibly live up to what Southern migrants expected them to be. They simply were not as different from the South as people had hoped they would be. Segregation, racial prejudice, all of those sorts of things were alive and well. The evidence that we have of that is what happens in many northern cities in the 60s. And those frustrations, I think, began to explode, both in political organizing and political movements, but also in violent rebellions as well.
In Hartford, in New Haven, in all of these cities, a new cadre of political leaders, community-based political leaders, emerges outside of the control of the dominant local political establishment.
The war on poverty was very big. The Community Action Agency, which also hired a lot of community people, gave them a lot of administrative experience, and became a really critical part of our community. And a lot of the folks who are involved now in the 60s came out of that war on poverty.
When we talk about the political empowerment of blacks in Hartford, we cannot use as our reference point the political empowerment of like blacks in Detroit, Newark, whatever, because the black population is so small. When the largest number of blacks voted, it still was a minuscule drop in the bucket. Nobody really needed their vote. It's only when they discover that they can get the attention of the political arena by creating disturbances and protests that the political arena begins to look at them.
They were protesting in terms of the police, in terms of jobs, in terms of social service, in terms of electoral justice. And you had people sort of waking up from the 50s saying, you know, things aren't that good. We really don't have a lot of equality going on here.
You get tired of being stepped on. You get tired of being ignored. You're getting tired of being looked at as a second-class citizen.
1968, I vividly remember the announcement of Dr. King and his death. To me, that triggered the beginning of the height of I don't care anymore. You killed our leader. You don't care. I'm not going to be good anymore.
In the 1960s and 1970s, racial tensions erupted into rioting.
It was just tumultuous times when people were just so agitated about injustice, about leaders being killed and assassinated. And, I mean, you just didn't know. The only thing to do was to strike out, because there were not a lot of options and not a lot of redress.
Connecticut saw racial violence in Bridgeport, Waterbury, Middletown, New Britain, Stamford, Norwalk, and Hartford. On Labor Day 1969, Hartford crowds battled state and city police, damaging nearly 100 buildings.
It began in the black communities. We burnt up and ran out all our drugstores. We burnt up and ran out businesses that have never come back to this day. We're still suffering those pains of the 60s. For individuals like me, you could cry when you look and say we still got a long way to go.
Besides protests and violent rebellion, African Americans used their increasing numbers to make inroads into urban political leadership.
With the demographic shift and the growth in the black population, blacks began to have dreams of winning the mayoralty, right? And they win, the first black to become mayor of Hartford is Thurman Milner.
But electing political leaders didn't necessarily translate into effective political power.
People really got involved with voter registration. Voter registration was really very big, but there was that illusion that they were participating in the election process. But in terms of people having specific responsibilities like ward chairman and having the ability to hand out lodges, it appeared as if a lot was going on. But the power and the control remained with the boys in the back room and the smoke rooms.
So what we had was black mayors like Milner and then later Perry assuming a mayor's office, and keep in mind it's a weak mayor's office, they have very limited power, over a city that's increasingly broke. So they run as politicos to a community, trying to convince the community that their election will mean something to that community, when in fact, substantively, their election is going to mean nothing.
Black political action went beyond elections. The Black Panther Party, a national African-American organization with revolutionary objectives, became a force in New Haven. A local black militant group in New Haven, the Hill Parents Association, allied with the Black Panther Party.
In New Haven, the association with the Black Panther Party and the Hill Parent Association came about because Freddie Harris and Willie Smith and others than those had to sit down with the people who were bringing the Black Panther Party here to let them know that the Hill Parent Association had been in New Haven working for the concerns of black people.
In 1970, the Black Panther Party became the subject of a nationally publicized and highly politicized murder trial in New Haven.
We had the military here for May Day 1970. We were occupied by the military while we were here, and that's not good.
The New Haven Panther trial became the focus of massive protests.
Kingman Brewster was president of Yale and said a black man couldn't get a fair trial in this country, and that created a big furor and what have you. So the racial issue was probably at its peak, modern day peak, in 1970 in New Haven.
After the Black Panther incident, some blacks who had never been involved in things before were awakened by the conditions and the inequities in the system. They were willing to get more involved.
While the Black Panther Party soon ceased to be a force locally, the period of black militancy left a continuing legacy.
The Hill Health Center was founded in the early 1960s, and it was a combination of parents from the Hill who'd had difficulty getting their children into Yale New Haven Hospital, actually, and the other St. Raphael's Hospital for routine care. The community had a place they could call their own, and they could come to a place where they were treated with dignity, where they knew that the healthcare providers cared about their health. Basically, it is a full-service healthcare clinic that serves a broad spectrum of the community, and the fact that it has had the kind of longevity that it has had means a lot, because it's a stable institution now in our community.
In the 1960s, another migration changed the composition of Connecticut cities. Increasing numbers of Puerto Ricans came to Connecticut, encouraged by an arrangement between the Department of Labor in Puerto Rico and Connecticut tobacco growers.
The Connecticut Valley Growers Association decided that this was a source of cheap labor and actually set up various mechanisms to recruit migrant workers to the Connecticut Valley for tobacco and agricultural products.
They made an agreement to send workers to the tobacco fields and to the small farms during the dead time in Puerto Rico, and then they would be returned to pick the harvest back home in Puerto Rico.
Those workers came 1 or 2 seasons. Eventually they began to like the area and decided to stay.
The problem with the migration of Puerto Ricans to Connecticut, especially the Hartford area, was that it was a migration of farmers, relatively poor farmers, who were undereducated, didn't speak English. We didn't bring our priests, our lawyers, our doctors. So you had a large number of people who would have been unable to settle well in San Juan. I remember people used to get arrested for loitering because Puerto Ricans live outside, you know, so hanging on the stoop, you know. So it was pretty awful.
Unlike some of the previous groups, the issues of culture and language were key obstacles.
The social agencies weren't prepared to deal with a population that didn't speak English. It was a very painful period. The schools, you know, the dropout rate was astronomical. Actually, it was teachers who were the first professionals who arrived here because the push for bilingual education started. And after the teachers came, you know, they have relatives that may be lawyers and doctors, etc. But that didn't happen until the late 60s, 70s. So it's relatively very new.
Puerto Ricans provided not only a major new ingredient in the cultural mix of Connecticut cities, but also the basis for a complex process of alliance and rivalry among discriminated against groups in the urban political arena.
African Americans have been here for a very long time and don't want to lose political power, certainly deserve to have, you know, political power, and they've worked very hard to be engaged in the political process. We're relatively newcomers. Our numbers are rising dramatically. We're now the largest minority in Connecticut, and that's something that, you know, would naturally set up a dichotomy, you know, a fear of I might lose my position.
But at the same time, on the political front and the economic fronts, as a result of the riots in the 60s and the disinvestment that happened to the Central Business District in Hartford and the white flight out of most neighborhoods in the core city, we had to join forces politically and economically to make sure that the neighborhoods that we lived in and called home were not impacted negatively. Hartford is projected to be the first Latino city in New England in the next 2 decades. Not only are we here, but we're here to stay and continue to make gains.
As African Americans and Puerto Ricans streamed into Connecticut cities in the 1960s, the industries that employed previous generations of migrants continued to stream out of them.
If you think about the last decade of the 20th century, by now, industrial concentration in the center of Bridgeport, New Haven, and other Connecticut cities is over. You find lost to the South and Sunbelt parts of the U.S. got lots of industry, which had once been in places like Bridgeport or New Haven or Hartford. And then, of course, and this continues, there are a great many manufacturing activities which can be carried out more cheaply in parts of the world where labor is less costly than it is in the United States, and that has indeed occurred.
In Connecticut as a whole, manufacturing employment dropped from almost 50% of total employment in the early 1950s to less than 18% in 1996.
All the big plants that had made Bridgeport known throughout the world closed. The Remington Arms Company, General Electric almost completely closed. All the plants, it seems, were moving their workforce either to the southern states or out of the country altogether.
Bridgeport had 3 major department stores here in the 50s and 60s. They all moved into the suburbs, just because that's where the population was moving. Therefore, that's where the economy was moving. That's where people were spending money, because that's where they were living.
The decades-long erosion of the city's economic base led to what was widely perceived as an urban crisis.
By the 1990s, industrial base was largely gone. Downtown Mall had closed. That was supposed to save the city during the urban renewal schemes of the 1960s. And things were not looking good for Bridgeport, and the city declared bankruptcy.
The city hit bottom in 1989, 1990. The subsequent mayor recognized that the city was very significantly in debt. That became publicly known and a fact of life.
Bridgeport's 1991 filing for bankruptcy became a national symbol of urban decay. Bridgeport, Hartford, and New Haven were listed among the country's 10 poorest cities. Money Magazine's 1991 survey of best places to live ranked New Britain and Waterbury as the 2 worst of the country's 300 larger metropolitan areas.
David Rusk came to the General Assembly, I think in 1994, and did a presentation of cities in the United States who were programmed to fail and had passed a point of no return. And Hartford, New Haven, Bridgeport, Waterbury were among those cities.
As Connecticut cities grew from local trading depots to concentrated manufacturing centers, they passed through repeated cycles of decline and renewal. In the face of the severe crisis of the early 1990s, many believed Connecticut cities had nowhere to go but further down. But the fate of Connecticut cities at the close of the millennium would be full of surprises.